I am speaking with Florian Brand and Lars Wilde, co-founders of Atai Life Sciences, now AtaiBeckley, and Compass Pathways. Among many other things to mention about Florian and Lars, I will just say that they happen to write my favorite Substack that everyone should be reading, where psychedelics meet entrepreneurship. Whenever they put something new out, I legitimately stop everything I am doing to read their analysis on the psychedelic drug development sector. Florian, Lars, thank you for coming on the channel today.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Jake.
So I know both of you have been starting, leading, and managing companies for a long time now. Can you share about your background, what led you to founding companies in the psychedelic drug development sector, and what you are both up to these days?
Do you want to start last? So because it sort of started
Yeah,
with you, so I don't want
yeah,
to.
true. No, happy to. So, I've been a serial entrepreneur now for 15 years. Have been building companies initially in healthcare and in tech, and then in a way stumbled into the biotech space. I think it's known. I lost a friend of mine, became very depressed, developed anxiety disorder, didn't respond to standard of care. And then one of my venture capital investors at the time in the company that I was running suggested I try psychedelic therapy, which I did. And then a single go got me rid of my treatment resistant depression and anxiety, which was fantastic. And, that made me think deeply about how can we get these treatments to patients at scale. And eventually this culminated in me co-founding Compass Pathways with Katya Malyevskaya and George Goldsmith. And then Flo and I, we've been building companies before, and then we joined forces to start Atai with Srini and Christian and have been building that. And then just to also answer your last question, so over the last 4 years, I've been focusing on the neuroplastogen space and some adjacent spaces and kind of figuring out, can we piece apart the biology of the psychedelics and then utilize some of the aspects that these molecules have in driving their efficacy and utilize them in other indication spaces, be it earlier stage treatments in the neuropsych space or neuropsych indications where psychedelics might be contraindicated, schizophrenia, bipolar, and as well the neurodegeneration indication space. Over to you, Flo.
Thanks. Yeah. I mean, you sort of summarized also my way into this. So I basically observed Lars's patient journey quite closely and how he was not responding to first, second line, and ultimately found profound, I don't know how you want to frame it, but like a healing experience maybe through psilocybin therapy. And that and I guess around the same time, my wife lost her mom to cancer. She really struggled with grief and had also a similar patient journey like Lars. And both of us then tried also a high dose psilocybin therapy session, and it was also profoundly healing for us. So I think there's for both of us, it's really personal. Everyone has a friend or a family member. In this case, it was even the kind of our own experience with this the standard of care that led us to believe there must be something better. And not only was it a profound experience for ourselves, all the data pointed into the right direction, right? And at that time, no one was. We might be talking about stigma later on in the interview on those compounds, but at that time, no one was really trying, except with MAPS, of course, and no one was really driving this forward from a professional drug development perspective, especially not a VC biotech mafia or we met it, etc. funded one. So they were very skeptical initially, and that led us then to become pretty much the first one with Christian's backing initially to develop a broad range of compounds, initially with Compass and then with the Thai for mental health disorders. So that's my journey to this, which all started with Lars's patient journey.
Thank you for sharing. And I thought I would just say, I really appreciate how both of you have shared about your own mental health journeys. I really appreciate that. And we need more people doing that. So again, thank you for that. I'm actually curious to ask you guys, when did you two meet each other? Was it like at university in Germany? Like, how long ago was this?
Well, like, what is it? What is
14
it?
years or so, right
25,
now.
14, 15 years. Yeah. 14, 15 years ago. I think it was in Düsseldorf where Lars where lived and where we built the first startup together. And then not only did we work very well together, we became also very, very close friends. Lars became my best man at the wedding,
Wow.
which happened maybe like 3 years after we got to know each other. So yeah, a very through that very intense work experience where I think we're very early to put in this, was it 669 or whatever they call it nowadays, like a lot of working hard in startup world. Through that we got to know each other very quickly, very well, and got along very well. And yeah, so through that we developed a very close friendship. Yeah.
Awesome. Um, I mean, what a journey it's been for the psychedelic medicine space, and like, I mean, just what a year it has been for the sector this year alone. You know, we've seen positive to mid to late stage data coming from multiple companies across a variety of compounds targeting multiple indications. I believe nearly $600 million raised in follow-on offerings in the past several months. And of course, big pharma acquiring a compound in this space. And may I just add one that doesn't skip the trip? So maybe we could actually speak about that first. So AbbVie is paying up to $1.2 billion for Bretisilocin, a short-acting 5-HT2A agonist and 5-HT releaser that showed very promising data in a small, I believe, single-site phase 2 study in major depressive disorder, MDD. Obviously important to mention here the $900 million upfront payment in this deal. Considering the stage of development for Bretisilocin and the formulation perhaps as well, this seems very notable. So maybe first, I'd like to ask you both, what do we know about Bretisilocin? Like what type of psychedelic experience does it induce? Is it similar to NN-DMT, 5-MeO, maybe a shorter acting psilocybin?
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I can kick us off. So first of all, huge congratulations to the team over at Gilgamesh. Fantastic job by Jonathan, Dalibor, and Andrew, who executed that one extremely well. Now, the molecule is a psilocin derivative, if you will. I mean, they're all from the same class of tryptamines, and in terms of the experience, obviously these experiences vary widely from one experience to the next, right? But I would put it into a typical tryptamine experience around the psilocin type, medium dose DMT type experience experientially. And then from a pharmacology perspective, it is very comparable to psilocin, which is the active metabolite of psilocybin.
And yeah, it's interesting. You know, I've listened to Jonathan Sporn in some interviews when speaking about Bretisilocin in the past, mentioning, yeah, exactly, similar to maybe, yeah, like psilocin, but also maybe with the 5-HT releaser component, there's some entactogenic effects. Does that make it at all unique to Bretisilocin, those entactogenic effects?
Yeah, I'm not convinced with that because in the end, these all substitute for serotonin, and a 5-HT releaser means that you have increased concentration of serotonin during the active experience in the synaptic cleft, which anyhow you would have from the psychedelic that are already overactivating the serotonin receptors across the board. So I would assume that experientially any effect from that should be rather minor. When you look at the entactogenic effects, seem to be driven a lot by dopamine release and oxytocin release, etc. So I think from a storytelling perspective, maybe a nice differentiator, but I think in the actual subjective experience, I would say that it would probably be very difficult when administered similarly in subjects to really differentiate these molecules, which I think is true actually across the class, right? Where I think there are some outliers, obviously, like a 5-MeO DMT experience, which is vastly different from these other experiences. But then I think, especially when we talk about naive patients, I think they would have a really hard time to kind of de novo differentiate whether they have received psilocybin or bretisilocin or whatever other closely related tryptamine there is.
Yeah, no, like you say, there's actually when you mentioned 5-MeO DMT being like a quite different experience, it's even interesting following this space like within the companies who are developing 5-MeO, the way the drug's administered can also really change the experience. And maybe we could talk about that later on. Another thing I'm thinking about with Bretisilocin, do we think that the fact that it's, a novel compound, maybe it doesn't have some historical bad baggage attached to it? Do you think that that made it like a prime candidate for an acquisition?
Um, so we briefly talked about it when we hopped on the call. So I think like the stigma risk around psychedelics has faded quite a bit. I think there was this episode where everyone was shying away from calling this compound group what it is. Like they were using like psychoplastogens, neuroplastogens, and I think there were like many kind of brand names for this category floating around. So I think that's kind of the macro perspective. So I don't think this stigma is preventing anyone from doing a deal. In this case, there was already a relationship with AbbVie, right? Kind of, and while they were saying they would never do a hallucinogenic a year after they did a hallucinogenic, I don't think it was because this one was called what it's called, the name that I can't pronounce. And I'll leave that to Lars. He's much better at that. But basically, it's a derivative of a known psychedelic, and I think that is it is at the core. Personally, yeah, I don't know, Lars. What do you think?
I think the uh, what made this deal maybe urgent is that I think by now what we are hearing is that many of the the big pharma companies are now very seriously looking at the psychedelic space. And I think what might have happened there is that this became a somewhat competitive situation where I think several companies were looking at kind of mid-stage, still affordable assets to acquire, and then there weren't that many around the stage of development, and hence it was rather easy for them to then just make a move on this one, because there you had the checkbox on the at least face value composition of matter IP, which I think that's a big one typically still in these earlier stage compounds to overcome for pharma. When you look at the BD teams and the M&A teams, it's early on in their checklist, right? How they think about it. Now, when you look at some of the most successful drugs over the last years in the neurospace, it doesn't matter that much, right? When you look at, for example, GW's Epidiolex or Karuna's Cobenfy KarXT, right? These are all drugs with very atypical non-composition of matter IP, but they're doing obviously very well. They're addressing massive unmet medical needs. Now, I think in terms of the differentiation of the molecule, I think anything that sufficiently hard hits the serotonin 2A receptor has a really good chance of driving efficacy, and then you have slight differences in the subjective experience. Now, what I think the obstacle will be eventually for AbbVie is figuring out how to deal with an injectable, because Bretisilocin, at least when we looked at it early on in the Compass days, we also made derivatives of that class. In the animal models, from a duration perspective, it didn't differentiate from psilocybin. Now, psilocybin, when you deliver psilocybin IV, it also becomes a 1 hour experience, and I think that's why the Gilgamesh team eventually decided to go and focus on an IV style delivery in order to shorten the duration, right? And I think that also made it probably a bit easier for AbbVie to think about, well, this seems rather shorter. It's a 3 hour kind of 3.5 hour experience in the clinic for the patient, and so I think that checked 2 boxes. And then an MDD population, I think there you stand a good chance to show a really good result, which Gilgamesh did, right? I think that also checked the box when you compare that result to any other antidepressant class performing in that patient population. Obviously, you're looking at nearly an order of magnitude better outcome. That's impressive.
And it was nice. I think it was nice to see that the low dose comparator in that study had some actually pretty strong psychedelic effects. So it seems like it was a good control to use in that study. I mean, yeah, listen, that data was really promising. We've seen a lot of promising data. I'm like losing track of the amount of companies that have released data in the past couple of months.
Yeah.
And
Maybe.
academics, right? I think they get a little bit forgotten here, but also, I think the body of evidence now for the MOA, I would say, is overwhelmingly strong, right? And I think that is, that's why I keep coming back to the idea of the GLP-1 class as well as a comparator, right? Where every pharma needs to own a GLP-1 program. They're trying to go into different indication spaces here, and I think with that overwhelming evidence. I think, one of the leading analysts in neuroscience space that Flo and I met at JPM this year said, look, what could be more exciting than being in a space where something actually works in psychiatry across the board?
Yeah. And that
Yeah.
was also quite evident, like bumping into investors at Jefferies in the healthcare conference. They're like kind of once they heard psychedelics, they were like eyes went up, and then so there's a genuine interest to it comes in waves, right? So we had this hype phase and we had the overcorrection, and I think now we're kind of on this upward trajectory again, where because of what Lars just said, right? A lot of data coming out that is compelling, and I think also they see that other funds, so the ones that haven't invested yet, they see that really reputable funds are now getting involved, and I think that data really helps to overcome this what once was a stigma. So I'm kind of going back to your initial question, this historical baggage. I don't see that anymore. Actually, Lars and I were in Boston 3 weeks ago at the Longwood conference, and there were two pharma CEOs on stage that used that word. So and that gives me confidence if they can, like, if they use psychedelics on stage, then I don't think it's a stigma issue why they don't get involved. It's more how do we successfully commercialize this? And as you know, and as we've also wrote in our blog post, I think the Spravato numbers just tremendously help to in these respective organizations, in the big pharma organization, instill that confidence that this interventional psychiatry model works, is here to stay, and that when you have compounds that somewhat fit into a day, that this is a worthwhile drug to develop and commercialize.
Yeah, and I guess in terms of pharma, it seems like at the end of the day, of course, this is just my opinion. It seems like it's too big of a potential opportunity for them to miss out on, and especially when you consider, the range of different indications that these compounds are showing good efficacy in. And looking forward to speaking more about that actually later on in this call. So yeah, I mean, you did speak about it a bit, but what does AbbVie's acquisition mean for the space? I mean, do we feel like it is only a matter of time before another large pharma follows AbbVie into psychedelic M&A? Do we anticipate seeing some licensing deals and what are the timelines that you guys are like looking at here with that?
Yeah, I can start and then please chime in, Lars. As we said, from all what we heard, it was a competitive deal. So there were other players looking at that and bidding to acquire that molecule. So that in itself is already a positive signal. And I think the number is obviously quite significant as well. Not only the total of 1.2 billion, but also the high upfront, which is usually more 25% or a third of a deal. In this case, was basically 75%, three-quarters of a deal, which I think shows you a high degree of conviction. And of course, also some competitive dynamics that might have pushed this up. But in the end, they kind of signed this deal and seem to have a very high degree of conviction. And if you basically unrisk, put that in RNPV model, so risk adjusted net present value model, and use usual psychiatry probability of success going from phase 2 to phase 2b to phase 3, and a discount rate of 10%, then basically it gives you a value at time of phase 3 readiness of roughly 6 billion. And if at time of approval, roughly threefold of like around about 18 billion. So that kind of shows you from an unrisking perspective, so assuming they kind of clear all those hurdles of successful phase 2b, phase 3, and approval, which we all are obviously, given the data that we have, believe will happen, then you see a very high unrisked valuation. And you see a tremendous disconnect also, by the way, to the public companies that are currently trading. So I think that is something that maybe the market hasn't fully digested, that actually in an unrisked way, or even like adjusted to the phase where those public companies are, right? Phase 3 ready or in phase 3, that there's that AbbVie paid a quite significant premium, which is higher than the typical 50 to 100% that you see. So we believe it's highly encouraging, and don't think they got us like they basically the market hasn't fully understood that upside potential.
Yeah, and I mean when it comes to the upfront payment in that deal, I remember I was looking through AbbVie's 10Q.
Yeah, you were the first one actually. Through you, I saw that number. Yeah,
I was actually speaking with Josh Hartman. He's like, it's gonna be in my bulletin. What's it called? I had to legitimately reread about that upfront payment because I just was not expecting it to be that high. That was pretty exciting news. Lars, how about you? Any thoughts on? I mean, is it only a matter of time here, where we see another deal happen? And maybe like
Yeah, I mean,
sorry, with timelines, I guess, do they need, for compounds that they might be looking at right now, do they need to see more data, or do we think that there's enough with some of these compounds in development?
yeah, I think, with AbbVie, when we looked at it from kind of a psychedelic vantage point, right, people said, oh, what a rich deal. When we look at it from kind of, what are typically, the takeout prices for late stage assets in the psychiatry and neurospace, it's pretty much in line, right? When you look at, the recent Avidity deal, when you look at, deals like Intracellular, when you look at Karuna, when you look at GW, et cetera, right? All of these deals are kind of in that ballpark, obviously in other modalities. And I think it's a really positive sign to see that, pharma doesn't differentiate and says, look, this is a great treatment for depression, and hence, it needs to be priced where it's priced at, right? And I think there, as Florian was saying, there's somewhat of this disconnection in kind of public valuations versus some of these private companies. And I think that goes back to very much, I would say, the interest from, let's say, atypical investors in the space, right? So you still have a lot of retail, which I think is great. People are putting, their own money behind these companies, seeing the great promise that these molecules have, right? But I think, with a retail investor, you have much more nervousness, right, when things are not going well in the markets. And that's why I think, these companies were overly punished in the years, 22 to 25. And I think there's still a lot of room, right, when you look at the average kind of price targets for these companies by the equity analysts and the way they're trading today, right? I think there's a lot of room for improvement, if you will. Now, on your question of, will we see much more M&A? I would say absolutely. The question is, at what point in time, right? I think, some of the big pharmas that have really large war chests, they might actually say, look, we don't care if we pay 3 billion, 6 billion, 12 billion. We just want to really see that we're buying an asset that, for example, can scale. Hence, with Compass, I think, the team recently in their recent quarterly reporting said, look, we're much faster than we were hoping for. We're planning with phase 3 results for the second phase 3 in Q1, right? And then, even assuming normal timelines, right, we're not far away from an approval potentially of the first true serotonergic psychedelic. And knowing how diligent that team is executing, and I think they would surprise everyone about the scale of, first, the need that we know already, but kind of how quickly you might be able to scale a true psychedelic. And I think when that is clear, I think then it will be just a run, right? Because there are only so many companies you can buy, only so many programs you can own, and hence I think then we will really see the bidding wars happening for these companies.
Yeah. And usually it seems somewhat of a dynamic unfolding if you have someone who's going first and is doing a deal. Let's look at Karuna and Karuna BMS, Cerevel, AbbVie. Right, so you see one person moving into a drug class, and then you often see someone following. And we also did some, I guess, in the summer at some point we did an analysis where we kind of looked at different pharma companies that might be more likely or less likely to get involved. I think actually someone who we missed and we wanted to kind of write a piece on is actually the ones that are developing GLP-1s, and Ella Lilly is one of those. So I think that is someone who is definitely in the mix because all of those have this patent cliff issue coming up, right? So if you look at their blockbuster drugs or highly performing drugs, they will have a quite near term, and some of those big revenue drivers will still go off patent in this decade. So there is some pressure to transact. Paired with that, okay, we have a big pharma now who went first. I think what we need is to have someone, like regardless of whom, to go first. And that paired with a good J&J. So for the classical or traditional psychedelics, we have J&J with Spravato, which is of course already kind of showing the potential here, and what people often underestimate how very few patients actually are getting treated on an annual basis. So they're now moving towards making 2 billion per year, but only 50 to 60,000 per year are actually treated with Spravato. So if you remember that there are around about 3, maybe even 4 million treatment-resistant depressed patients. That shows you how very little of that market has been addressed so far, and how much room there actually is for all the psychedelic companies that are currently developing short-acting but also longer-acting to have their place in the treatment paradigm.
Maybe to briefly build on this, I think one of the big opportunities that people are completely overlooking is at the moment, most of the companies are focusing on treatment-resistant depression or depression with one failed treatment attempt. You have one outlier in a way with MindMed going after generalized anxiety disorder at late stage, right? Which I think is a great indication space and captures the different side of the same coin, if you will, right? There's a lot of comorbidity between anxiety and depression. However, I think, what makes the class truly exciting, which is something that, when we at Compass, we try to look at preclinically, right? Where can we take psilocybin initially in the next generation psychedelics? So we know that the translational value of all these preclinical animal models is not great, but effectively any model we tried psilocybin in just produced a tremendously positive result, right? And so, early on when we shared this, I remember, George and I would be speaking to investors. We said, look, we got all of these exciting results. And then people would be like, well, there's not such a thing as a transdiagnostic treatment, psychiatry, that's unrealistic. And, then, we had this massive benefit, right? That, we were running clinical trials. We had an IND open and, approvals in Europe to run clinical trials with psilocybin. And so many amazing investigators reached out to us and said, hey, now why don't we try psilocybin in bipolar? Why don't we try it in anorexia? Why don't we try it in body dysmorphic? And then again, we saw the same signature of response in all of these human trials again. And I think that is something that I think pharma has not recognized because they haven't really deeply enough looked at all of these adjacent indication spaces where psychedelics will work. And right, I think, if you actually, Flo and I were writing a piece on that, actually looking at, what is the true breadth of where this treatment might go. And I think, just one analogy here is I think, when you look at Abilify and peak sales of Abilify and just a tiny sliver of the indications that psychedelics might cover, you get a true sense of how, despite the obstacles, right? Yes, you need to deliver it in the clinic, and it's, that might make it somewhat harder in the beginning, but kind of the peak sale potential of these drugs at scale and the indications where this can go is massive. And it's just a matter of time for the pharma folks to catch up to this. Flo was mentioning Eli Lilly. And I hear that, they are also now regularly at neuroscience conferences where results from these psychedelic studies are shared and produced, right? And so I think, very quickly the teams at these pharma companies in BD on the research side will catch up to the true promise of these treatments. And I think then it's pretty clear that everybody will have to own an asset in the space that is serious about psychiatry.
Yeah, no, and you guys mentioned that piece you put out on Substack looking at pharma companies who you think might be interested in the space. What was the title? Turn on, tune in, buyout. That's a great title. I gotta actually add that in the description 100%. Lars, you mentioned retail investors in this space. I am a retail investor in this space. I actually hold right now a AtaiBeckley and Cybin. Now the question I get from a lot of my fellow retail investors, especially after they've been seeing posts from Christian Angermeyer now maybe shifting towards being very pro the short duration treatments. He's skeptical about the commercial future of longer acting treatments. So yeah, retail investors will reach out to me and they'll say like, "Oh, is there like no future now for these longer duration compounds?" So I'd like to ask you both, do you feel that so actually I'll add in medium duration here too, because I guess RE104 from Reunion Neuroscience is probably in between short acting, longer acting. And as you said, perhaps Bretisilocin will end up fitting in there as well. But do you
Right, because they're planning to reformulate into an IM, which based on
yes.
my limited CMC understanding is that it will not shorten, rather prolong, or at least also kind of make it less spiky, right? So we'll kind of make it definitely a bit more flatten the curve a little. So to be seen. If you look actually at the phase one that I also linked in our last Substack, the GM 2505, because I can't pronounce the name, it basically it's a little longer in terms of subjective experiences. So the PDPK, if you compare it to the DMT and the 5-MeO DMT results from Atai, it seems to be 25-30% more to the right. So to your point, Jake, it might well be through the reformulation that it's landing a bit more in the 3 to 4 versions into the 1 to 2 hour time frame. I would agree with that. Yeah.
No, thank you for the color. I appreciate it, Florian. I mean, yeah, so from your point of views, I guess, and of course, nothing here is investment advice. Do you feel that, yeah, that all of these psychedelics, are they an investable space, for example? Like, do you feel that, yeah, there's room for everyone here, or in the long run, also we have to take into account timelines here, I think, but maybe do you feel in the long run that it will be short duration that takes over? Very curious to hear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As you say, right, we have a vested interest in the space, right? We're still shareholders in, the companies that we founded, and then across the board, have, also, my family has invested in Gilgamesh, for example, right? We're invested in Delix and others. So just to put that out there, obviously we're biased in our views, and clearly this is indeed no investment advice. But I must say I can share my personal opinion on this, which is that, I completely disagree with the notion that the short psychedelics are going to be a winner takes it all market, right? I think they might offer some improvement in terms of, and especially when we look at redosing, maybe it's more convenient from the time a patient really needs to spend in clinic. But I think there are a couple of ways to look at the topic, right? I would say one is look at all the approved classes of antidepressants, antipsychotics, anticonvulsants, etc. Right? You see, there are many drugs with the same MOA approved. For whatever reason, we don't know why. I know there are people that respond to Prozac, don't respond to escitalopram. There are then people that respond to citalopram and so forth, right? So we have $7 billion SSRI-like drugs treating depression. And I think the same will be true. We're seeing that as well with the psychedelics. These are not panacea, in that they don't work for everyone. We've seen that in the clinical trials clearly, and there's still a lot of wishful thinking out there, right? You heard the narrative on microdosing. I think now we've seen the first truly powered study actually showing that it seemingly doesn't work. Right. And I think we're now catching up science-wise with some of these claims. And so, I think there's a good chance that there might be people that do not respond to psilocybin, that do respond to 5-MeO DMT, that again don't respond to LSD. And it will take a long time for us to understand why this might be. I think that's one, right? So I think, why would we expect in this drug class to see something completely different from any other psych drug class? So that's one. the need is massive. I don't think the duration is an obstacle, right? When you look at, some of these truly resource-heavy treatments we have in psychiatry and depression space, like ECT, TMS, DBS, all are billion-dollar interventions. Psychotherapy is one of the biggest single markets in the world, psychotherapy that is, right? And so I think, that gives you a sense for, what is the magnitude here of the need and where this might go. And I think the other way to look at it is also from a pricing potential perspective, right? When you look at, Spravato, I think the initial treatment cost is, somewhere between 18 to 20,000. I don't think there's a truly official number, but I think that's what one hears through the grapevine. And then I think the yearly costs are around 45,000. Now an hour of therapist time is maybe 100 to 150. So if you put, if you have a treatment that's maybe 3 hours versus 6 hours in the clinic, you're saving $450 on a treatment that, sells for 45,000 a year. So I don't think that it actually it's not a needle mover in terms of total cost of treatment.
Okay.
And then the last thing that I would say is that people are oftentimes overlooking is patient preference, right? We know that obviously there is recreational use, right? 2% or so of the adult population are using psychedelics. And there are people that love 5-MeO-DMT. There are people that love ibogaine. There are people that love LSD and prefer these substances over the other substances, right? And I think that's something that we will also see where somebody might say, look, a psilocybin experience is somewhat more gentle. And hence I prefer that. And someone else might say, look, I actually, want to go in, I want to have a reliable experience that delivers an experience that's kind of congruent. So I choose 5-MeO-DMT and I'm able to leave the clinic within 2 hours, right? And so I think these preferences will also play out. Last thing I'm going to say here is that, when you look at in the first year or, the first $1 billion of sales of Spravato were generated, I think, from 60,000 subjects in the TRD space. And I think, depending on how you slice and dice the need in TRD, you're looking at, 3 to, some figures are claiming 8 million addressable patients in the US. So that also shows, what the need is. And then I think Oregon actually has shown that kind of in this in-between market of, psilocybin mushroom therapy in Oregon, they are treating 10,000s of subjects now at scale. So it also shows you that a treatment like psilocybin is highly scalable in a single US state alone. So if you look at the entirety of the US, for example, as a proxy for the market for such a treatment, you realize how big that is. Now, I think, what's great is that, Spravato is doing a lot of the heavy lifting now, pre-qualifying centers, training staff. And I think you will see that staff. I think that, the staff themselves, right, they will be interested in delivering a variety of treatments. Later on, right, we're seeing that in the clinical trials, many of these therapists are cross-trained. Some are still recruited from the old Spravato trials, have gone into psilocybin where we started that, now are involved in the 5-MeO and DMT trials. And so I think those folks will also want to use the whole bandwidth of treatments that will be out there in the real world. So anything from your end on the topic?
No, I agree. And so Lars and I, as I mentioned, we were in Boston, New York, and actually talking to a few biotech investors, and they were like, guys, tell your friends that they can relax a bit. We as a biotech investor, we don't need to believe that there's this one winner. There's actually 5 blockbuster SSRIs that made between, and I think we put this in our, just looking it up, I think between 1.6 and 3.4 billion US dollars at peak sales. They're somewhat differentiated, right? So I think what they're looking at time of approval, is there sufficient time exclusivity to make money with that, and is it sufficiently differentiated? So you need to somehow differentiate, right? So if you look at the SSRIs, they are somewhat differentiated from each other. Once you have differentiation, I think there's money to be made and patients to be treated. So I think that coming from also a biotech fund tells you somewhat also how they think about this, and agree with the patient perspective that Lars mentioned. And also what we'll see is, of course, will be some first movers, or one first mover, which will, I believe, be Compass. I believe they will be the first psychedelic let's put MDMA in that category as well. I personally believe they will be first in 9 months, and they will probably have, depending on how quickly LSD will come to market, they will have their fair share of being the first one, and building a certain first mover, or leveraging a certain first mover advantage. And the last point that I want to say, I can't remember, but yeah. So basically, I think we can relax somewhat. I think there's not this holy grail. I believe when they come to market, as Lars also pointed out, they will have somewhat of an advantage, but not a massive one. The shorter duration ones. So I think there's sufficient space for all differentiated drugs. I think what I want to say on LSD, I think Mindmed is working on that. I think once you go outside of that working day window, then you run into some issues, right? So that's usually 8 hours, 8 to 9 hours. But once you're like hitting more 10, then I think you're running into scheduling issues. But the CBT codes will be are on an hourly basis. So as long if you're doing in 2 hours or 6 hours, that will be similar from an HCP perspective. From a payer perspective, they might develop different perspective, right? They're obviously incentivized to pay as little as possible. So we'll see. But I think all of the differentiated psychedelics will have blockbuster potential. That's my short version.
So I'm hearing room for everyone here potentially. So that's cool to hear. Now this topic I'm going to bring up with you guys, I'm going to be honest, it's driven me a bit crazy for the last couple years, because I've never really gotten great answers from people on this, so no pressure at all. So as an investor in the space, something, again, I really have not heard convincing answers on this in multiple ways. How do we interpret clinical trial data when looking at companies who are studying their compounds in major depressive disorder versus treatment-resistant depression? I mean, I think it's pretty clear that treatment-resistant depression, it's harder to treat. And I guess like when we're investors trying to look at which comparing the efficacy of different compounds, like how do we do that? And I also have other questions related to MDD versus TRD, but yeah, long story short, in terms of like looking at the efficacy, how do we like look at that? How do we look at that?
I mean, I can maybe start with a historical perspective, and then I think Florian, I know, has a very differentiated opinion on that question. So we, especially my co-founders, actually before we even started Compass Pathways, they had already sought advice from some of the leading payer organizations in the world, be it insurances or state organized payer systems, and they were pretty clear that when they look at the space of depression care, they actually feel that patients in first and second line are adequately treated. And I think, there's a lot of negative talk about SSRI use, where I feel like, these are phenomenal drugs for so many patients. I think we do them injustice to talk so negatively about them, because we see that roughly 2/3 of subjects with an MDD diagnosis respond really well to 2 treatment attempts with SSRIs, be it the first or second one, right? You got a roughly 1/3 chance. And I think that is fantastic, because imagine this was not the case, where we would have to now treat everyone with a psychedelic. This was completely overburden the payer systems, right? So I don't think this is actually, from a commercial angle, scalable, right? How do you treat everyone in depression with a treatment that by definition will be resource intensive, right? And so the guidance back then was clear. We are fully supportive of a development program, but please focus on treatment-resistant depression, because still 1/3 of patients will end up being diagnosed with TRD, meaning they don't respond to standard of care. And that's such a big need. And already that will be a challenge to treat enough patients in that sector. Now, I think, there are obviously proxies we can look at. Axsome has done a phenomenal job over the last years, actually getting a new and differentiated antidepressant to market, actually focusing on kind of, I think, MDD with one failure, if I remember correctly, but definitely with an MDD label, and you see where they priced this, right? And I think this was priced around 5,000 a year, pre-rebates, etc. And that shows you how differentiated the pricing power is when you see, a yearly supply of a drug in MDD versus, let's say, take Spravato, 8 weeks, 18,000. That's a very different need, and this is driven by the patient demand and also kind of the patient cost to the payer, which is something that's rarely discussed. But an MDD patient might still be functional, right? They might still go about their daily lives. Their comorbidities are much lower. Once you're a TRD patient, right, that's when the cost to the payer explodes, and that's when you actually have the leeway to actually price an even more resource-intensive drug.
And I guess, I don't know, in my head, I feel like there's something to mention about studying the drug in a population group that are the ones who are actually going to be receiving this drug. Perhaps some people look at depression as just it's depression. It's like the same for these different subsets. But like, for example, like Auvelity, you mentioned, really, really great data in MDD. It's one of the, I believe it's the first rapid acting take home medication for depression. Again, good data in MDD, but they did not meet their primary endpoint in TRD. And, my understanding is in real world clinical practice, this is probably going to be prescribed mostly to TRD patients, which now I'm sure there's the placebo effect working in real world clinical practice. Maybe important to mention that, but yeah, like I guess coming back to psychedelics, why study a drug in a patient population who I guess at least early on might not actually be the ones who are receiving that drug?
Yeah. So I think it has mainly clinical operations reasons.
Okay.
And I agree with both of your assessment that when it comes to having those payer negotiations and needing to do the health economic modeling, etc., you want to have the data of the patient population that you're treating. Otherwise, you will run into severe issues, convincing them to reimburse them at a reasonable price point. So what we see is that MDD is easier to recruit. It's just per definition, there's a larger pool of patients available. And that is, in my understanding, at least a key driver to take that indication, show a signal there. But the problem is if you do it, of course, in phase 3, then you're sort of either you do another one in TRD, or you definitely are somewhat stuck with that population in the label.
Okay. Okay. And I guess when it comes to the data readouts, like I think when it comes to MDD versus TRD, I think, listen, this is my opinion. I think the Cybin data also being an adjunctive treatment as well with CYB3, I think that data is going to look really good in MDD. I think MindMed's data with MM120 is going to look great in MDD. But, some of these companies, I think like MindMed and Cybin are gonna maybe make some claims like look at the durability of this treatment. I mean, I've already seen some of this, like and again, I really respect Cybin. I'm a shareholder. In their investor presentations, they're talking about, this might maybe even just 2 doses a year. But I mean, is that actually going to be the case? Like if it's going to be prescribed to TRD patients? You see where I'm like a little bit confused here with this.
I mean, that's where you will see the frustration by the agency eventually, right? And when we talk about, what will the label actually be able to claim, right? And then, what will actually be able, what will payers actually be able to pay for, right? Because, when you want to treat TRD patients, you also want to know what the drug does in TRD patients where the need is at, right? And I think that is something what we're seeing now. It's difficult to treat TRD, and I think that's where we, as you say, right, we should really understand what can we do in TRD, because, and I was really intrigued with the 2-dose data by AtaiBeckley and with the 5-MeO drug, which looked fantastic. And I think, obviously, small earlier stage in the exploratory study. And then, the second dose in the phase 2b trial also looked fantastic, right? So you drove many more patients into remission. So I'm really curious. I think, the real, rubber meets the road data we're going to see from Compass's phase 3 now, at a really large trial in phase 3, 2 subsequent doses, three dosing arms. So I think that's going to be great. I think, my hope is that, we can learn much more in that population that really needs it and hopefully figure out, what is the right dosing. You also mentioned adjunct, early on in, Jake, you will know this, but also for all the listeners, with COMP360, for example, we took patients off their standard antidepressant medication pre the dosing session, actually. And patients did not have any withdrawal effects, and that was quite intriguing to see. So it was easy for them to come off the antidepressant medication pre-treatment. Now, some patients, and I think when we talk about treatment-resistant depression, that doesn't mean that patients do not respond at all to treatment. It means they have an inadequate response to treatment, right? And so there were subjects in the phase 2b trial at Compass Pathways that were very afraid to come off their antidepressant medication. And so we ran an exploratory study where we said, look, we keep patients on SSRIs. And I think that shows how important science and hypothesis formation are in this space, and not just going off some strangely formed opinion. Because, at that time, people said, look, if you're on an SSRI, you're going to have a blunted psychedelic experience, and you're likely not going to respond positively to the treatment. So what we saw there is actually there was no decrease in the intensity of the experience, and patients that remained on an SSRI, seemingly in a small cohort, had a more durable response and higher remission rate. Yes. So, how great would that be, right? When we say, look, actually, we find out that SSRIs and maybe psychedelic treatments are synergistic, and we can keep people in such a tremendous disease burden, on treatment that they're already on, and treat them on top. So I think, my frustration, you can hear it here, is I would love people to focus on the indication where the need actually exists, which to me is in all of these indications, either the very severe patients or the treatment-resistant patients. And then I think also, the other frustration that I have is now everybody seems to be going after depression, where I feel like, there's such a breadth of indications to pursue. Why are we not seeing, how can we treat more patients with these really promising medicines? So, maybe that's just a rallying cry to all these companies that there's so much more to do and so much more to explore, to spend money at.
Yeah. And actually, maybe that could bring me to this next question I had for you both. Speaking about like expanding to different indications. I'm really excited about the potential of psychedelics to treat substance use disorder. That's one that's definitely I'm paying close attention to. Even things like traumatic brain injury, pain. So yeah, most of these companies, as far as I'm aware, the lead indication is TRD or MDD. I guess what type of data needs to be generated for these compounds to be used to treat people suffering with these mental health conditions? Do these companies have to run new phase 3 trials? Like, what does this look like?
We can go quite broad with psychedelics, right? So Lars is doing some super interesting work on at Pangea. So I think they have broad applicability. I don't know, Lars, you want to share about what indications you're looking at, and then we will look maybe at the most advanced psychedelics and where they could be applicable.
Yeah, I spoke about it briefly earlier on. I'm at the moment running a company, Pangea Bio, which we've been building over the last 4 years, where we're developing neuroplastogens that focus on the downstream mechanism from the 2A activation, being direct activators of synaptogenesis, which is a necessary condition for the psychedelics to have a durable effect. So there's good published evidence of the psychedelics as well as the NMDR antagonists, so the ketamine class of drugs, converging on activating the TrkB receptor, tropomyosin kinase B receptor, which is normally activated by brain-derived neurotrophic factors. So that drives the neuroplasticity response in humans. And we know that most every neurocondition has an element of synaptic loss in different areas of the brain, depending on the condition. And so we said, look, it would be actually very nice to have a very clean drug that can drive synaptogenesis or class of drugs. And so that's what I've been focused on over the last years, because I think there are some indications that you really cannot treat at scale with a true psychedelic. That could be, for example, neurodegeneration, right, where you would want to treat actually chronically, because oftentimes, we have a very crude understanding to this day what really drives Alzheimer's disease, right? We see that, even the amyloid, the very aggressive amyloid beta antibodies, they're only able to slow down disease progression by 25%. So A beta also wasn't the holy grail. The tau antibodies are failing now in late stage clinical trials. So, we need something that can actually, if you will, regrow and counteract the disease. And so that has been my focus. And I think also diseases with a, let's say, psychotic component, be it schizophrenia, etc., that are clearly diseases of synaptic loss could very well be treated with such treatments. Now, you mentioned, for example, substance use disorder. I share your excitement with psychedelics. I think there's, abundant evidence from real world use in legal settings of psychedelics having a tremendous impact on sufferers with such a condition, because there we oftentimes see kind of deep-rooted trauma. We see trauma processing during the psychedelic therapy experience, right? And then you see this prolonged experience of neuroplasticity afterwards to actually then use the insights from the therapy session, take them back into their normal lives. And I'm very excited with that, which goes back to my former plea to say, look, let's explore all these other indications where, we have good academic small study evidence, and now let's take the next generation molecules into these classes. And that takes me maybe back to commercial. I think the patient need is abundantly clear, right? But on the commercial front, right, I think one thing that probably holds a lot of the psychedelic drug developers back is, let's say, for example, you take psilocybin or 5-MeO DMT into, let's say, an opioid use disorder. You will see tremendous side effects that are not drug related, but could potentially be drug related. So they might end up in your label for depression. Hence, I think, all of these next generation psychedelics that, sit in the portfolios of these later stage psychedelic companies are a great potential to be taken forward into substance use disorder, obviously, OCD, different types of anxiety disorders. There's so much to do, which I think is exciting. Then there are very adjacent indications. So I think, for Compass Pathways and for Atai Life Sciences and whoever else, gets across the finish line with their lead molecules to say, look, we got an approval for treatment-resistant depression. Can we actually have a meaningful discussion with payers to see if they were willing to maybe, use a biomarker and already start treating patients after an initial failure to SSRIs, because we now have a good EEG biomarker telling us this patient will not respond to an SSRI or SNRI. Also to look at other depression indications, be it postpartum depression would be one, suicidal ideation, which is what Spravato did, right? They got initial on-label TRD as an indication, and then eventually went into suicidal ideation. I think that's an obvious one, right? So I think, to go broad there, I think bipolar type 2 might be an interesting one, where Compass, for example, has generated good data a couple of years ago, right? So I think PTSD is another one where I think there's a huge indication overlap. So I think I would look at the Venn diagram of, someone with depression, what other indication might he have, and then look at, through actually copy pasting what has worked really well in the past. I think it's not reinventing the wheel. It's, running regulatory relevant expansion studies to then increase the label breadth of these treatments, which will allow you to actually, you don't have to go off label, right? You can be on label and actually treat a much larger patient population, which I think is very exciting, because that's not far away, right? We're always talking, post approval, maybe we're talking like 2 years to see the next indication to hit the market.
Yep. No, I agree. And just like technically the process, there's an established process with the FDA for that, right? So it's a supplemental or an NDA, SNDA, where you basically align with them. Okay, what is the efficacy data that you need? safety data. You have to a certain degree, obviously from the previous safety, so you might go something like an integrated safety summary, and then from there you run the trials, generate the efficacy data, and for BPL-003, obviously kind of most biased here on that compound myself, being for a long time with AtaiBeckley. We have seen some positive data in AUD, alcohol use disorder, and I know, Jake, you're also quite passionate, I think, about the SUD indications, and that's then the way how we can, post TRD approval, get or expand the indication set in a very well established process with the FDA.
So much to speak about with the psychedelic drug development sector right now and what's going on. And so to the viewers, this is going to be part one of a series with Florian and Lars. And Florian, Lars, thank you so much for coming on the channel. I'd like to leave you with a last question, and that is, yeah, what are you looking forward to seeing in the coming months and years? Any readouts, any milestones, any specific companies you have your eyes on?
I'm obviously biased, just coming out of Atai as their CEO, to basically see the VLS-01 and EMP-01, so DMT and RMDMA readouts next year. So these I'm personally looking forward the most, and I think the first one is public guidance is, I think, Q1 for RMDMA. So I'm looking forward to Q1, so the fresh start in the next year, hopefully with a very strong, compelling data set from that trial.
I'm excited to see that data as well. And the only AtaiBeckley's only company looking at social anxiety disorder right now for
in the psychedelic space, right? There's Vistagen, of course.
Yeah, definitely. Have a readout soon as well. Yeah.
That plays in that space. But yeah, so I think from the psychedelics field, AtaiBeckley is the only one. Yeah.
Yeah. No, thank you. No, I'm excited as well. Lars, how about you?
Similarly biased to Florian, obviously very excited with the readouts of AtaiBeckley next year. And then, with Compass Pathways, I'm really intrigued to see the results from these two high dose COMP360 sessions. I'd be shocked if we're not seeing a result that will be much better than for some first phase 3. I think, from a patient perspective, we've seen that, put yourself into a shoe of a patient, right? Having been maybe depressed for 15 years or so, right? And then, for the first time having a psychedelic experience might be difficult to stay present with the experience, etc. And then coming out of the experience and feel like, oh, it was an incomplete experience. Maybe there's more to process, etc. So to have the ability in a clinical trial setting to then give a patient the opportunity to go into a second session, I think that has a really good chance of hopefully, showing even better results than these single dose treatments we have seen thus far. So, obviously that's the first study with that setup with such a scale and a treatment that, lasts maybe 5 hours in the active experience. So that I'm really curious from a scientific perspective to see, obviously hoping for a positive result. And I think that, will unleash much more interest into the field, I think. So, I think with that, this, a rising tide lifts all boats. I think this will be good for all of the companies in the space. I'm very much also looking forward to see MindMed's approach in GAD, which is, this massive unmet medical need. We have very inadequate treatments. I think that the team at MindMed is fantastic. And I'm curious to see how they will deal with the length of the treatment. I know they've been thinking about it and speaking in the past that they are thinking about a way to make this shorter. If they were able to do that, I think that would be also really fascinating. So I think there's a lot of really interesting data coming out. And, of course, right, running late stage clinical trials takes a lot of time. So we've been sitting here waiting for that data now for 3 years, 4 years sometimes. So, it's going to be a whole year of Christmas next year to see all these data sets hitting, which will be really, really cool.
Yeah, plus the regulatory, hopefully first approval and maybe a voucher kind of becoming on the next or one of the next commissioner voucher programs that will be released. I think they're now releasing them on a sort of monthly or 2 monthly basis. So I'm hopeful that psychedelics make it on that list fairly soon, given what I've heard on I guess from the Maha summit. There seems to be quite a positive sentiment from the government as well as regulators on this compound class. So very, very excited also on the regulatory front.
No, definitely. It's never a boring day following this space, that's for sure. And I think that's going to continue on into next year. It really is incredible. Florian, Lars, thank you so much.
So it's
Thank
fun,
you.
Jake. Thank you very much.